Hey guys, so today I'm going to be introducing History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. This was a book that was written back in the 12th century and reports to tell a history of Britain from the time of its founding all the way till what was then the present day in the 12th century. Now, this book has pretty much been discredited since then, largely kind of moving into the modern era. And that's for several events that it includes in the book that we no longer deem as historical. So this would include stuff like the story of King Lear, which Shakespeare adapts for his play. It also includes a lot of different facts that we've determined to be false, and also has a lot of the supernatural element in it. This is both seen in the retelling of King Arthur that has, especially including the story of Merlin as someone who doesn't have a father and is able to practice magic and such. It also includes other stuff like saying that Britain was originally inhabited by giants before people had to drive it out. And best of all, kind of tying into the classical tradition, it holds that Britain was first settled by the descendants of the Trojans in the Trojan War, which we read about in antiquity. So because of all this, a lot of people nowadays kind of look at this book and kind of ask why it's worth reading, because, hey, it's telling all these events that really aren't true. So what's the purpose of it? And you guys might be asking, why are we reading yet another history book for a literature class? So these are all great questions. And I think kind of the way that we want to be looking at this book, and definitely the way I'll be teaching in class, is to understand, even though it's reporting to be a history, we want to kind of dig past the title. Because really the important thing is in here, it's going to be looking at what are the stories that Britain is telling itself about how it was founded. That's really what this book analyzes. Each culture and each civilization has a certain story that they tell itself of its founding. For example, the Greeks had the story of the Trojan War that we see in the Iliad and the Odyssey. With Rome, we see an example of a fictionalized account in the Aeneid, and one that's really written after the fact that not a lot of people would actually believe, since it wasn't written until Julius Caesar, but is one of the stories that Rome ends up telling itself of its founding. And I think in the history of the kings of Britain, we get to see a similar thing, in that the best way to understand is to read it similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey of, okay, yes, you can look at it and be like, oh, none of this really happened, but if you do that, you're really missing the point. Because the point isn't the fact whether or not this history actually happened, since a lot of it was discredited, but the point is, what is the history that Britain is telling itself at this time about its founding, and what are some of the themes that we can find in the book? So that's how we're going to be approaching it. We're going to be approaching it as literature similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey, in that there's some quasi-history going on, but its relevance is really much more as a work of literature than a work of history. So that's kind of an overall approach to how I want to be approaching this book. Now, a couple specific things that I want you guys to look for is, like I kind of mentioned in class today, in our discussion of Beowulf, things are a bit different now and then with the terms of nations. So today we largely define a nation by the borders, okay? Like we've got these little lines that separate one country from another country, and the different governments are in control of them and all that. Back then, though, much more important than borders was blood, in that we have the Brits, and we have the Scots, and we have the Irish, and we have the Picts, and all these don't get along with each other. And it's not just that they're separated by borders, it's that they're different tribes, they have different blood. And this is much more important to them back then, and you're going to see this kind of influence popping up time and time again in the book. Another thing you want to look out for is, similar to the other books that we've covered, is that you're going to see a lot of very human and flawed heroes here. There are going to be different people that are protagonists that don't really necessarily do the best things. And we're going to be trying to explore some of those in class, and you want to look for it. But overall, what I want you to look for, what I'm going to want to explore in class, are what are the national stories that we tell ourselves. So the Greeks told their stories, the Romans told their stories, the British told their stories, and as I'm going to talk about in class, the Americans, we tell ourselves our own story too. And this is something that me and Mrs. White were talking about this past week, is that the America, we have our own little story that we tell ourselves, and a lot of it is historical. But as we're going to talk about, there are certainly accounts of American history that are idealized because it's the story we're trying to tell ourselves, and we don't want to necessarily paint ourselves as flawed when we can paint an idealistic version of ourselves. Anyway, so those are a list of things that we're going to be looking for when going through this book. So I'm really excited to go through this book with you. There are a lot of really fun stories in here that I'm looking forward to analyzing, and I think you'll enjoy this book a lot. So looking forward to discussing this with you next week.